Okay, we start. Thank you all very much for coming. If you came because of the advert, you'll see that, we are missing one person who was going to be here, who is Dr. David Flynn, who is a psychiatrist. And because of him not being here, that's changed a bit what we will be talking about, but it'll still make a difference that he was going to be here. He is the director, he's the chair of a collection of, it's called the Adamson Collection, and it's a collection of psychiatric art. It's art made by psychiatric patients, a bit like the more famous German, the Prinzhorn collection, which was worked by psychiatric patients in the 19th century. And what we would have been talking about, I should think, would be the work of art considered as a symptom of a condition or therapy for a condition. That's something that has to do with art therapy, but it's also a way of, it's been an approach to thinking about trying to understand works of art not made by psychiatric patients, in other words, works of art made by artists. So the most famous example being Van Gogh and his illnesses, whatever they might have been. One of the diagnoses of what was wrong with Van Gogh is a thing called Geschwin syndrome, which was, and a syndrome is a collection of symptoms or behaviours. And I forget what they all are. It's quite a long list with Geschwin syndrome, and I forget what they all are. But if you know anything about Van Gogh, if you know a bit about the biography of Van Gogh, roughly that's having Geschwin syndrome. What I'm instead going to talk about, instead of these works of art that are the outcome of conditions, is more or less the opposite, which is something that happens very, or is referred to very early on in the book, which is the case of Willem de Kooning, whose art seems to have produced in spite of his condition instead of because of it. So I'm going to read the passage which talks about that, and then me and Matthew will talk about de Kooning a bit, I think. So this happens early in the book. The character who's going to become the artist in residence, this nameless narrator, is being interviewed, and he begins to talk about de Kooning, and this bit is a background to why he's talking about de Kooning during this interview. Ben asked how my practice as an artist related to neuroscience. Now this was the question I was ready for with my de Kooning catalogue. It's to do with something that happened when I was an art student. While sitting in my space looking at reproductions in a catalogue. In art schools, back when we got a space, a squalid cubicle divided from its neighbours with 8x4 sheets of plywood. One of the tutors, a painter with a brief spell of success in the mid-80s under his belt, came in and stood looking over my shoulder for a bit. You know he had Alzheimer's when he did those. He wandered off again. I didn't know anything about Alzheimer's, but I was, still am in fact, a big fan of Willem de Kooning. One of the key abstract expressionists has worked with the last word in real painter's painting. In fact, he is frequently referred to as the last great painter. Jackson Pollock was the greater innovator, but he really only had a couple of great years. Up until 1950, he was a more or less competent plodder. No obviously outstanding talent. He found his métier, the dripped and splattered field of action, and then having produced a dozen or so masterpieces, got self-conscious about it and got stuck. De Kooning, on the other hand, with his big, luscious, slippery, oily brush marks, managed to straddle the divide between traditional easel painting and the extemporised field of action painting, and he kept at it without putting a foot wrong for decades. I read the catalogue essay, not something I'm normally bothered with, and found some mention of an illness, problems with his memory, but the condition wasn't named. It was only in there to make a point about the artist's struggles with adversity, in being indomitable and so on. I looked around a bit. There was nothing in the college library. Eventually I found a book in a charity shop, Coping with Alzheimer's, a text which made free use of the bullet point. I looked at the symptoms. First you have these warning signs: development of intense suspicion and fear of others, inability to follow through on projects, such as tending a garden, sewing, or organising an event, the onset of depression, sudden onset of drinking bouts in a person not previously given to drinking, outbreaks of irrational rage, unbelievable stories of bad things done by others. Those are some warning signs, and we all have days like that, don't we? And they're not very different from the symptoms of Alzheimer's disease, which may include decline in personal hygiene, staying in bed for long periods for no reason, becoming fearful or anxious for no apparent reason, having domestic accidents, such as leaving pots burning on the stove or leaving appliances on, showing inconsistencies of memory or behaviour, hoarding one kind of food, such as 18 tins of beans or 8 sacks of oranges, mood changes unrelated to external events. Again, we all have days like that, don't we? What happens in the next phase of Alzheimer's is dementia. You become demented. They don't know what causes it. It may not have a single cause, but what's actually happening is that your brain is dying. The worst thing about this is that your lucidity kicks in and out, at least in the stages leading up to dementia, so that you are able, in moments of clarity, to watch yourself die. When your brain dies, you die. The book mentioned another condition which is similar to Alzheimer's, but with a clear cause. It's called Korsakoff syndrome, and it's caused by drinking too much. William de Kooning certainly drank. He's supposed to have been a bottle of whiskey a day man. Found a few other things. A question and answer interview in the course of which de Kooning apologises for his occasional forgetfulness, and an account of his later years by one of his studio assistants, his daughter, I think. This didn't give much away either. Looking again at those late paintings, I tried to spot the giveaway signs of deterioration and dementia, and I couldn't see any. I tried to discern robotic unsubtlety or hand-fistedness, but the late work, whilst not amongst his best, is still full of invention, odd compositional tricks and balancing acts, an acute sensitivity to the unpredictable push and pull of improvised abstraction, not the mindless repetition of a rote-learned formula. It still looks fresh, this from a man who can't remember his own name and needs to be washed, dressed and fed. Of course, by the time the illness had kicked in, an illness that's notoriously difficult to diagnose even in ideal conditions, a lot of the symptoms would have been invisible. De Kooning had become an emperor of the art world, a millionaire baby with lots of people to do stuff for him. There was really no opportunity for him to demonstrate his inability to shop or keep up to date with household paperwork. Odd sleeping patterns, bouts of drunkenness, depression, strange outfits, irrational outbursts, all this is fine in an elderly millionaire genius. The disease may have been quite advanced before anyone even noticed. And anyway, no one had any reason to start noticing that Willem was losing his marbles if he was still producing 1 or 2 masterpieces a week at $500,000 a bite. By the time Alzheimer's, or Korsakoff's, had become an unmistakable fact, it had already been years since he'd had to do anything for himself. Clean a brush, stretch a canvas, clean up, sweep up. All he had to do to get a prime de Kooning was park the old boy in front of a prepared canvas with one of those famous long-handled brushes in his hand and watch him go. I found it was quite unsettling. I sat in my space, looking at my own heavily wrought, man-sized improvisations, and they seemed to have gone blank. What does it mean when work like this can be produced by an automaton, with no conscious sense of past or future? A painting monkey, a cash machine. So what I was saying earlier was that in terms of the relationship between pathology and art, it reverses the normal vantage point. Normally, it's one approach to art criticism is to try to attempt to understand the work of art by regarding it as a symptom and seeing it as something that shows what was wrong with the person, or if that was Mozart is another famous or common example of somebody who's often been diagnosed with things through his art. And there are numerous other things with numerous other examples. And the mad artist is a stereotypical figure. And with de Kooning, it's the exact opposite. The pathology is invisible in the work, or seems to be.
I think it's true that those late paintings that you wouldn't actually, if you didn't know anything about, this would be a hard thing actually to have this set of knowledges and not knowledges, but if you didn't know about the story of de Kooning and you saw those late paintings, I don't think you would necessarily immediately think they were by de Kooning, but you certainly wouldn't think they weren't any good.
No.
They do, as you say, and that's a very good piece of, very wise bit of observation, actually, art historical and your own thoughts about it. They certainly do look like incredibly competent and interesting paintings. They don't have the intensity and complexity of earlier periods, and they don't have that giddy, zany, Valium silliness that's very lively and sort of a great mixture of aggression and comedy of the works that led up to them. The 70s works where they were dripping and falling about, and they're monsters that are not really like, they're not cubist, I suppose, like the 50s work.
Yeah.
There's some kind of new floppy language he's got going.
Yes.
But they do have a very white emptiness. And, one could say, oh, perhaps that's the emptiness of his mind, but I think that's like saying the turbulence of Van Gogh is the turbulence of his mind. There's something sort of wrong about that.
Yeah. I mean, they're obviously less physically vigorous in their so if there is the obvious decline, it seems to me, in the later works, is the less evident physical vigour. So there's so can you see the work of an older man, but not of a crazy man or a man who's
there's literally less in them, which is different to late Picasso, where Picasso was as old or even older and must have been physically as frail or even frailer. But they're weirdly muscular, those.
They are.
Right up to the last minute, and they seem incredibly sort of, the mind going, really sharp with those cubistic games that he's playing.
Well, he was frantic about it. De Kooning seems to be quite serene in his...
Exactly. Picasso seems to be afraid but not mad.
Yes.
And de Kooning's maybe Alzheimer's and not particularly afraid. Because as you say, everything was down to the fact that the paintings were started by other people. Tubes or paintings all squeezed out.
What different is us from animals is knowing that we're going to die, and maybe de Kooning was in a state where he had no sense of mortality. So there was the airiness, it was carefree, because he literally was carefree. But
there's another element of pathology, because in your book, your hero is an artist. He's kind of half you, or maybe a lot of you, more than half. And one of the amusing things about the book is his deadpan, but actually tinged with bitterness, description of his behaviour as an artist, which could easily strike someone outside of the art world as pathological and obsessive and as mad, actually, that he, of course, those of us who've had some kind of art background know that there was a period in history where artists thought it was perfectly rational to do 6 12-foot wide paintings a week that they couldn't sell and store them and had no meaning for anybody. And they would go decade after decade thinking vaguely at the back of their minds that one day my boat will come in, but probably not even thinking that anymore. They're just sort of obsessively following a routine which had a meaning at one time for them. Probably doesn't anymore.
Well, he's an adrift modernist. His models are
a sort of romanticism.
Yes. So, and he romanticises his substance abuse because he thinks he thinks it was great that Jackson Pollock had a piece in Peggy Guggenheim's Fireplace. And anybody now with any sense would think, well, if that's a gesture of defiance towards a powerful collector, then it's not much of a gesture unless it's Peggy Guggenheim who would have had to clean it up herself, and we all know that it would have had to be somebody else's awful job. So we've kind of, that's one side of the maturing of the artist, that hopefully we know not to do that for that sort of reason. Sort of gone a bit off the generation that taught me modelled themselves on the abstract expressionists, but without the market with the abstract expressionists, and also in England, so not even being, so that they were removed historically and geographically from the models for that kind of behaviour. But doing very, very big paintings whilst drinking a bottle of whiskey a day was sort of okay. It was plausible because you could sell the thing, and there were people who were drinking a bottle of whiskey a day and producing huge paintings, and as you say, storing them. And none of them, not noticing a pathology that makes up your whole lifetime, whole generations of art teachers, not one of them saying, hang on a sec, aren't we all doing something that's obviously not, a lack of self-awareness. There's a different lack of self-awareness now from that lack of self-awareness.
And there are degrees of madness. I suppose a very simple definition of madness would be dysfunctionalism, that you simply don't function. I went to film once in one of those asylums in Austria, which is quite a famous one, but I actually momentarily can't remember its name.
Yes. What's the film about?
20 years ago, it was about madness and art. It was how culture rewards madness. There are bits of it on YouTube. I think someone's posted it in 10-minute sections.
It's from the old times.
A real mental ward is very disturbing because of all the smells and the people that don't have any control over themselves. Like, we seem all quite relaxed in our chairs, but when you're in a mad ward, you really know what disinhibition is. But of course, this was a special ward where they were all artists, and they were actually incredibly gifted artists, very, very visually talented. Some of them had been that before they were. It was a sort of incarceration, actually. They were there for a very long time. Sort of paedophiles and really disturbed people.
Yes.
But their work shared with that characteristic of outsider art of repetitive patterns and horror of a void, filling things up. But there was nothing there that wasn't quite powerfully impressive.
Yeah.
Maybe not so much even on the subject matter level, because I don't even remember the subject. Some of it was mostly scribbly writing, and some of it was images.
Yes.
But what was impressive was the holding together of I guess, an image, regardless of whether it was made of words or cartoon pictures of monsters.
Yes.
The holding together, which partly I think people acquire the gift of just by doing it for a long time, but partly because they had a very narrow focus. These people were sort of dribbling and in a bad way, and they'd sometimes wander off. But on the whole, they were there every day, and getting better and better at their outsider art.
Some kind of art that gets, as you say, there are things, there are characteristic behaviours, symptoms that when a patient is asked to do it on a piece of paper, will look characteristic. And there's the thing, hypergraphia, which is writing and writing and writing and writing,
right,
until it becomes, to anybody who's been to art school, it looks like a very sophisticated word.
It becomes rhythmic.
Yes, yes. If you just write the same word over and over again, because you can't stop. We don't mind I'm still totally unsure what I think about outsider art, psychiatric art, and amateur art.
Well, like Aboriginal art, well, this is an offensive comparison, outsider art is often institutionalised. So at this place there was a commercial aspect to what I was seeing. That work was packaged and sold, and it was catalogued, and there were art historians who sort of processed it.
Yes.
And it relied on there are certain traditions of intellectual inquiry in Austria that include Prinzhorn and others. And so these were sort of privileged, really very, very disturbed people who were contained in this place, did this stuff, and it was was researched, packaged, and sold. You know, it went out into the world. And that of course is what happens with First Nation Australian art, which is all done on, as it were, reservations in different parts of Australia, and goes back to a tradition not really of bark painting, but of the 1970s, when the first white guy went out with a truck full of canvases and acrylic paints and sort of institutionalised.
And lots of people were going, well, that's spoiled their authenticity. They're not making the pigments out of mud anymore.
Yeah, and there's no doubt that they're not. It's not on bark, it's on canvas, but it's a new tradition.
Yeah.
And there's a hierarchy, you know, it's incredibly diverse, but it is a new tradition. If you're trying to think, what is it ontologically, or what is it art historically, it doesn't really relate. It does, in some ways, relate to Dreamtime and all those, you know, mythologies, and to the rock paintings, but in more ways it doesn't. You know, it's very complicated how it all works, and actually the audience for it in Australia is usually aware of all these subtleties.
Yeah.
And some of it is aesthetically incredibly refined, and some of it is much cruder, just like art, you know.
Yeah.
But I think that with the famous maddies in Western modernism and pre-modern art, I think they tended, like de Kooning, to do it despite madness. As far as is known, I think, but Van Gogh didn't really do much work when he was really in a mad state.
No.
He mostly was recovering from a mad state, or a bad state was about to come. While it was on him, he couldn't really work.
Well, one of the reasons for wanting to kind of think about art in medical terms, what Faraday calls the clinical and critical discourses, is because people find it very difficult to understand modern art, and it's just a way in. It's we did it like that because it had something wrong with it.
Yeah, modern art it's a rarefied thing. It's baffling to people.
In that,
madness,
it's related
to bafflement.
It's related to wishing to see art in terms of autobiography.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
which it explains, and wishing to see art in terms of autobiography explains the success of at least one prominent British artist in the last 50 years.
Who? Oh yeah. Do you think she's mad? I think she's more...
No.
She's an egotistic monster,
I was thinking about... no, she's not mad.
Oh, you mean people believe that mad Tracy from Margate?
No, I mean, as the comparison was with ways of finding art accessible and or explicable.
Yeah.
And seeing it as a symptom and seeing its autobiography are related in that way, but they're not one pathological, one is simply autobiography of any sort.
Well, there's two things I would say. One is that drinking and madness are sort of, they have a connection often. That, you know, anyone who's had any experience of alcoholics, you know, there's often what is known as self-medication. They're often bipolar. You know, those poor people who are really drunk on the streets, who live on the streets, they tend to be schizophrenic. Even though they drink, you think, oh, they drink too much lager. But they're not out on the street because they drink, but because they're schizophrenic. You know? And anyway, I've got to remember the two things. One is the relationship between, you know, in the modernist idea of art, artists are bohemians. That's an idea that's sort of drifted away now. But so, you know, de Kooning had a long history of scatty behaviour and drunkenness. And drunkenness that could be very nasty, and drunkenness that was benign, all sort of shades of drunkenness, you know. A sort of behaviour that we would find very difficult now to put up with. That sort of male subjectivity, which is probably, if Jackson Pollock and de Kooning were here now, would be quite shocked by how different they are to how we nicely behave on the whole now. But so alcohol plays a role in the mythology of art, connected to madness. But the other thing I want to say, before we forget why we're here, is to ask you, what do you think it was in you that made you think it'd be a good idea to have this exploration of deranged states in your novel, which is really about two things, really. One is a sort of a very, very funny and incredibly accurate narrative, emotionally, of what the art world was like in the 90s, I think. Very, very rare, that accuracy. But the other strand to it is very intriguing exploration of neuroscience, which you've managed to sort of novelise and make work. in the neuroscience, there is all the time the issue, well, what is it if your brain doesn't work, if your mind doesn't work, which more or less we think of as madness.
Okay.
Why were you, and do you continue to be fascinated by that tie-up between art and madness?
Neurological conditions aren't quite madness, but I know.
Yeah.
The capacity to reason and romanticism both seem to have occurred in our culture roughly contemporaneously in the sort of late 18th century, well, as values.
Yeah.
Where they seem to have ended up, they seem to have ended up crudely in art and science, which are kind of traditional sparring partners. This answer's going to be rambling because there isn't really an answer to it.
Right. But you're saying that it's a sort of intellectual inquiry for you. It's not necessarily grounded in your own life experience, or you're not sure how it might be grounded. Because the beginning of your answer is a sort of intellectual thing.
Yes.
Telling you. I wondered if you had been too drunk, or you never felt mad, or if that's what made you want to write about it and make it to a story.
Yes. I can't find anything in my autobiography. I mean, I've used autobiographical incidents in the book, especially if they're funny.
Yeah. Not
because I want anybody to know about me, but sometimes writing a book, you've inadvertently researched something just by having done it.
Yeah.
I haven't got a good answer to that question. Why the book has two parts. But most books have one setting. This has two settings. But art and science do traditionally go together, or they're, as I say, traditional sparring partners. And I'm surprised there isn't more things, even though it's a well-known phrase, art and science. There aren't more things that are about art and science. And the artist in residence as a real thing, where somebody from when we spoke before, I was thinking about the fish out of water. The Fish Out of Water is a standard comedy and dramatic setup. And an artist in residence is an actual thing where somebody is put into an alien environment.
Yeah.
An artist is put into a factory, or I know lots of residences are in places that have artists there anyway, which seems to be a bit pointless.
Like the National Gallery.
Yes, I know. Why is there one there? But when there's an artist in residence somewhere where you wouldn't have an artist anyway, and there seems to be some it can be potentially fertile, although in the book they don't really know why they've got one anyway. The subjects are both interesting to me, and I don't really there isn't a very obvious.
And the opposition is interesting.
Interesting. So I happen to be interested in both of them. It's also a classic and standard setup for drama. And also, one of the things I look for personally in anything I'm reading, either that it's funny or that it's interesting. And very roughly, the funny bits of the art world, because it's not art itself, but the art world, because it is ridiculous and it's funny. And the interesting bits have to do with neuroscience. And then there are passages where they're sort of dealt with a bit together, like that one about the cocoon.
Yeah.
So it's like that in order to write a book that I would want to read, I suppose. But as a I think our culture is a place where the relationship to art and science is something we really, really need to think about. So I wrote it to be entertaining, but also because I do want to start a discussion about art and science and about there was one of the few sort of well-known things written and said about art and science is a lecture that actually nobody's heard, but people have heard of by a chap called C.P. Snow.
Yeah.
Nobody knows why they've heard of C.P. Snow's this thing. And he described art and culture as being art and science as being two entirely distinct cultures within
Yeah.
Two things that have no language in common.
It's something that Melvin Bragg would subscribe to, and it makes it easier with sort of popular introductions to either culture or science to think of them as opposite. And then in more elevated levels, people would probably intimidate us with their knowledge that, oh, there's not really any difference, or science isn't really objective and art isn't really romantic.
I know you can draw all sorts of parallels like that, but something that's, I mean, the difference has existed for a long time. Something that's changed and made it more acute is the orthodoxy within the humanities of an axis of thought that comes from France, in which a hostile relationship to science isn't ignorance, but it's a principled position.
Yeah.
Because science is felt to be aligned with roughly the right.
Yeah.
That's so the C.P. Snow's problem has become more even less tractable. He characterised it simply as mutual ignorance. And now, at least from the arts and humanity side, it's dressed up as a principled position. Scientists on the whole, the ones I know, don't care at all.
About whether they're considered to be on the right or not?
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean,
or if they're better or worse than artists?
Well, they don't think of what they do in their job as anything to do with the politics, whereas artists would. So, so I mean, I know a friend of mine, a physicist, who's sort of decent, sort of basically socialist, bloke, has those sorts of values. I mean, he doesn't talk about it very much. He has basically good values, and he's a physicist, and he's one of the group of physicists who discovered quite recently that gravity propagates in waves rather than diffusing evenly, which is a big deal.
Yeah. Well, I had the sense reading the book, and I'm sure this is wrong, but it's just that I had this sense that when it was things that I could identify with directly, I felt there were stories that were just there in the top of your head waiting to come out because they had such a lovely flow to them, and the wit of them was so peculiar to the spirit of those times that I couldn't imagine anybody else doing that other than you. But also there was such a lack of research about it. The authenticity came from the voice, that you just felt, well, that was a voice who's experienced it. Whereas I felt with the neuroscience, I couldn't tell if that was off the topic or not, because I was completely unfamiliar with it. I couldn't tell if you were looking it up as you were going along, or if that too was stuff that's easy for you and you knew it very well already.
Yes. Well, I'm glad you couldn't tell the difference. I mean, it was because the voice, which is what people who tell you about writing novels is an important thing, was very important, and that when the narrative breaks off and the narrator starts to talk to you directly about something to do with science, and just explains it to you, and if it's successful, it's supposed to sound like somebody not lecturing you, but somebody who's interested in the subject and knows about it and can tell you about it informally, doing that before they go back and, oh yeah, what's I on about? And going back to it. So it's exactly that. So it's a voice that will sound exactly like the voice. So it's written in something like, or something that reads like conversational English. I've been annoyed when people have said that there's not much style to the novel. It's so difficult to get, because if you actually write down what everyone says, or what you say yourself, it doesn't read like that at all. So writing in such a way as to give the impression that it's somebody kind of going, oh yeah, did you know this? Yes, that's me accepting.
Well, I'm happy to give up.
As me construing.
I mean, I was amazed at how successful the book was on so many levels when I read it when it came out in its first version a couple of years ago. One thing about, for those of you who have read it or know something about it, the love interest in the book, who isn't the sort of bitter, disappointed love, who's a curator, is a woman who's got a really severe condition, which is a real condition apparently,
Yes.
of not being able to remember past 15 minutes. Or?
Yes, well, I know this relates to the condition is it's called anterograde amnesia. It's the inability to form new memories.
Yeah.
So, and what one of the things that he loves about her is that she's her sunny disposition, and she's physically very attractive as well. But it's her simplicity, and she's called Emily, and she's like an idea of an attractive woman he's very interested in. He, like a lot of middle-aged men, he takes pop music far too seriously, and he likes early Pink Floyd, and she's called Emily, and see Emily play, and so falling in love with a sort of woman child, Victorian sort of. Is she mad, or is she just an elfin kind of otherworldly being? She's like that because there's something really wrong with her.
She's being studied in the institution.
Yes, she's a patient.
Where he's an artist in residence.
And he's aware, he's aware, because he's not stupid, that he can't really be falling in love with somebody who's like that, whose personality isn't really a personality, it's the outcome of a neurological condition. But at the same time, because he romanticises everything, he thinks, I know I can't be in love with her, because she's only like that because of what's wrong with her.
Yeah.
But he also thinks that I know I'm really in love with her because he romanticises it.
Yeah. No, he's very good at looking at his double self, admitting things and covering things up.
Because he's not stupid, but at the same time he won't accept what's wrong with his worldview, which is that it's not okay to be. Well, it's not okay to be drunk at lunchtime every single day. It's not okay to fall in love with somebody who's obviously got something wrong with them. And even if the question of consent to have sex with him could not seriously arise on any level.
Another element of the book is how is getting a grant, which is I think that's a sort of something that possibly might be coming back into art world's mythology, but for a while just sort of seeped away from it because you could make so much money.
Yes.
So the whole idea of 30 years ago, where the horizon of those artists we talked about earlier was that they might get an Arts Council grant one day, or they might get some teaching one day. That was about it, really.
Yes.
Whereas now you might be in Pace or Gagosian one day, or in the Venice Biennale.
Well, one of the ways he's a fish out of water as an artist in the neuroscience neurology clinic. But he's also now a fish out of water in what the art world's like, because he has no aptitude for paperwork.
Yeah.
And a professional artist now is very professional, and they are very good at filling in forms. That's professionalism as an artist now. And lots of artists are surprisingly and even shockingly good at paperwork. Some of them actually really love it. So when he's being interviewed, his rivals, he realises that these are the current professional artists, and they turn up with laptops and they're immediately working. He hasn't even got a computer, he hasn't got a mobile phone. As it turns out, it's not giving too much away. He gets the gig because the money offered for it is so poor. Yeah. And the other young professional, the younger professional artist,
he's not really competing with too many people.
He's not really competing with anyone, but he gets it because by default. Yeah. But yes, the way artists are now being different from how they used to be is one of the things. And he had an ex-girlfriend who's also that sort of person. She's a curator. She's a very ambitious young curator.
She administers the world that he's failing in.
Yes.
And his humiliation at her hands is a sort of a metaphor for lost values or changing values in a way.
Yes.
But he doesn't know if he ever really had those values, because he probably can't remember when they turned to being his excuse for failure, as far as I can get it.
That's very true. Actually, I'm sure but that's exactly
there is that turn.
Yes.
It's one could perceive in people.
Yes.
Even, we mustn't judge anybody, but
well,
one does have friends like that.
Well, it's something that happens a lot in the art world,
if anyone's been in the art world for any length of time, inevitably,
probably in any professional
there
world.
are reasons for why they've. Well, I mean, there are jobs in which you can embark on it with a kind of realistic idea.
Yeah,
of doing
that's
it.
right. Yeah.
But with an art, I mean, a parallel would be like with a sort of, I don't know, in a cop show, like the young cop who gets involved in the police because he's interested in justice, and all the old cops go, justice. Don't talk about it. And well, to people who have been teaching in art schools for a very long time and who I said, I can't get in the studio anymore. I said, and you go, well, you don't want to do now.
Well, yeah, it's very hard to sort all those things out because there is something admirable about people who do create an autonomous life for themselves that might be considered by some people to be a bit mad. Life is so, what's presented to us as enjoyable and good life is so ghastly now that there's almost something admirable. It's come around again now, those breeze block studios. You think, okay, well maybe I'll just sort of disappear in there for 30 years and do paintings that nobody wants. It's better than this sort of banking life and the values of the Evening Standard or something. But did you feel that when you were putting your book together, I guess you just had to get your head down and do it, but did you ever think in a big picture way that, well, maybe this is a complicated allegory for complicated issues which I would find it hard actually to resolve in a couple of sentences, about alterity and conformism, and how those opposites play out in the world beyond art and within art? Romanticism, madness.
Exactly that, like that, and doing what people sort of, it's a bit of a kind of cop-outy phrase, but when people sort of talk about the subject matter of their show, of an exhibition, they say it addresses such a thing, which means you can have a question and sort of not answer it. I should turn it around.
Yeah.
I think at that point, if anybody wants to talk about anything or ask us anything, he's here.
Have many people not read the book?
I think most people haven't read
Most
the book.
haven't read it. Has anyone come across it yet? No. So just a few of you have, yeah.
Oh, so you ask, have you got your hand up to ask questions?
Yes.
Yeah.
Why is the protagonist nameless?
I haven't got a very good answer to that. It's very early on, but when you're sort of trying to convince yourself that you're writing a book and that you're going to actually really do it, you give yourself rules that you have to stick to, just to make it seem like it's a sort of a realistic thing to be doing, that there are criteria at work here instead of there being no criteria whatsoever. So having a nameless protagonist was an arbitrary rule fixed on to make me feel at the beginning as if there was some rules governing this process because at first there seemed not to be.
So did you not think this second version that you could have given the name?
I could have done it if anybody had. I mean, it's been through multiple versions, and many things have changed through advice. I mean, this one, Artist in Residence, that Nat helped me through, and lots of changes were put through, came into the book as a result of that. And there were earlier ones, and one of them was in an earlier version. He didn't have a girlfriend at all, and somebody said, it's okay, it's a bit bleak, but it's fucking bleak. So can't you give him some sort of relationship? So I sort of, can't you have a girlfriend? So I went, all right, it's Susan. And the girlfriend is, oh right, actually Susan, could be Susan. So the girlfriend, and she's not his girlfriend actually during the book, but he has been her girlfriend, and actually having been told to do something or asked and taking it as an imperative really improves the book. It's every time somebody tells you something to change something in your book, you kind of get a bit cross. and then you give it about an hour's thought, you think, actually, and put a little bit of thought and work into it, and you think, that's actually going to make it better. Charles, yeah?
What's the next one?
Well, I've written two books which I think are completed, but might well not be. And one of them is called Optical Illusions, and it's also set in the art world, and it's set in the two halves of the art world, the academic art world, the commercial art world, which are daft in their completely different ways. So the academic side of it is it's sort of a campus novel. The campus novels are usually set in literary departments in universities, but this one's set in an art school. And it has a lot about the daftness of the orthodoxy of postmodernism and post-structuralism, and the fact that people can happily sit through seminars literally talking gibberish and nobody saying, hasn't this last hour just been, we might have just been going really? I mean, I've sat through seminars and I have wanted to say, none of it, what any of you said makes the blindest bit of sense. And I've had the sense also not to say that, because it would have been very, very offensive to a lot of people. Because it's a kind of language that it is language, but it's not being used in a normal way to convey information. It's language that's there to signify membership of a group, a kind of culture.
Yeah. Very, very dry, combined with the outrageously surreal and often really quite disgusting moods, the dry and the surreal, makes the mood of the whole thing very like early Evelyn Waugh, and maybe even middle Evelyn Waugh, right up to Gilbert Pinfold.
Yes.
When you mention the campus thing, that makes some of the best of David Lodge come to mind as well.
Direct influences on the book are both King James and David Lodge.
Yeah.
I have to say that I think one of the great things about artists in residence is the way you set up contrasts. So you have this sort of clinical, sort of aseptic world of the Neuroscience Research Institute, and you have this sort of mucky, mad world of the art scene where you can go to different private views. And you can really enjoy, as you return to each private view, where you're introduced to something else that's going on in the sort of mad venal scenes of the art world. You have this, the laugh gets bigger. It's like, it's like the comedic thing of go back to the joke and the laugh swells.
Yeah.
And if you didn't intersperse it with the science, I think you need, there's that lovely thing of sort of taking a breath and looking at something else in a slightly different mode, and you work that so well.
Yeah, the structure of it, the intricate structure of it is very successful.
Yes, and I think in the way that artists use contrast,
Yes.
to create great work.
And the way that the shows, the exhibitions that you go to, it's not that they're like a lurid mainstream newspaper's idea of sensationalism.
Yeah.
They're that Goldsmith thing of what other trivial bit of life experience hasn't yet been made into art.
Yes.
And you've really nailed that. And each one is more and more nothing. And seems absolutely right to the people there compared to the private view.
Well, it's a running. It's a thing that you probably recognise, which I said the basis of that. The running joke is that there are multiple chapters of the same title, another private view, and each private view, the work in the exhibition is described, and they're not based on real exhibitions, but they're based on something which artists do when they're sitting around, having cups of tea or whatever. Is as a joke, think up daft ideas for exhibitions, and then after not very much thought, thinking if I was had the energy, if I was more inclined to sort of pursue people for fun, for resources, that's not a daft idea. That could be a goer. In fact, a lot of people think conceptual artists are people who have ideas all the time. They're not. A conceptual artist is a person who has one idea and then has the energy to spend months and months and months realising it as a spectacle. In fact, for a conceptual artist to have more than one idea is professional suicide.
Do you think, Simon, that if
this book was given as an A-level novel to A-level students, that it would actually put people off from going to art school or encourage more people to go, because I think it shows such a bleakness of the internal workings of the art world as it is a kind of regulated money market, unregulated money market, money laundering market in many respects, with so little soul attached to it, it seems, that it doesn't seem to have the fun that pop art gave to art students, why everybody rushed at a certain point to go to college. Do you think this could actually be detrimental?
If not, I don't know. I mean, things are received in very surprising ways. I mean, there's the in satire. Anybody who's read a book in which they're satirised famously tends not to. They laugh at the ridiculous figure in the book that's actually a portrait of them. So how it would be received if it was widely read in art schools or by people who are thinking of going to art school, I think is actually unpredictable. I don't know. I mean, some people have said that people should read it instead of thinking of going to art school.
I think it would encourage the right kind of people to go to art school.
Yes.
It's very grim. It would encourage a sort of funky spirited, original, isolate to go.
Yes. I haven't. There haven't been enough readers of it, of enough generations and backgrounds for me to sort of have an idea of how that would be. And so, and also, I want the outcome of I want the book to be a big enough deal that hasn't so far unpredictable outcome. I look forward to that.
You know, the sort of grim thing. I don't know quite how aesthetics work, but you can have a very grim subject. Then it's the intricacy and the cleverness and the pizzazz of the way that the subject evolves as a structural thing constructed by a maker, that is the writer of the book. That has a sort of joy. That's where the hope is. It's in the aesthetic making of it.
Yes.
And you know, that's what you get in Goya, say. We've got the grimmest of all subjects.
Yes.
But it's like, you know, very champagne in terms of the amazing beauty of the crystalline beauty of blackness. That you can do it. So those who haven't read it, I wouldn't want the impression to settle in that it's a sort of dead weight book, or that it's a heavy brick that is going to depress you for months. I mean, it's absolutely, it's very funny, the humour is very black, and it's sort of dense with cruel originality, you know, or a grim originality. It summarises the best of the black joie de vivre of 90s art, I think, and it sort of ditches all the sort of fake stuff. Sorry.
No, I didn't mean to make it sound like that, because I just think it's one of the funniest books that I've read for a very long time, and I'm very hard to please as a reader and also as a writer myself, and I know how difficult it is to write that kind of lightness of touch in a novel.
And
that's why it's so successful.
I should say that it's about things.
Yes.
And I want there to put out issues on it, but it's meant to be something that people read really for pleasure. It's meant to be an enjoyable book.
Well,
yeah.
I'd like to hear you talk more about it, which I don't know if you call it the style exactly, but a technique maybe, which is kind of like invisible technique, which is what I think is good. It's like when writers write, when you can't see the writing, when actors act, you can't see the acting. And to a certain extent, you know, illustrators and artists, that kind of thing, if you're kind of focused on what they're portraying rather than how they've done it. I think that's quite unusual at the moment.
Thanks.
It seems like a kind of almost
It is supposed to be like, you know, seeing a swan glide across and not realising that its legs are going like that under the water. It's the prose is as well, I touched on it earlier. It's meant to feel as if they're being spoken to by somebody, so, and particularly with the
you kind of, that's how to do it.
He said it almost feels like a manifesto of how to do it.
Oh, right.
I guess you mean that sort of self-deprecation, which actually is very constructive.
Well, instead of being showy, it's kind of like the opposite of showy. I mean, the only other person, Hornby, I suppose, kind of does that. And like say Kingsley Amis as well.
Well, Kingsley Amis is really influences. I mean, it's a really unfashionable reference. I mean, anybody of my kind of rough group and generation, all their influences tend to be, well, they're like Burroughs, Ballard, and anybody French, basically.
I think when we're talking about Kingsley Amis, it's Lucky Jim and everything else. It's very much Lucky, and your novel's very Lucky Jim.
Yes.
I think the rest of Kingsley Amis isn't worth a huge amount of attention.
Yeah, well, you're wrong.
And I think Lucky Jim's never been on an academic syllabus because it satirises academia so brilliantly.
Do you think that's the reason? I think it's because he's he became well known and he sort of played up to this kind of daft kind of images of sort of right-wing curmudgeon. He became a kind of comedy version, a bit like Egan Raw actually, became a comedy version of himself in the media as a public figure. So he ruined his own. I mean, he didn't care about his whether he studied anyway. Yeah, I mean, I think he actually is read in academic as a
set book
in American universities quite a lot, because they don't care that sort of him as a public figure hasn't rained on his parade. But he doesn't have the antipathy towards him is actually mild and sort of old-fashioned. It's not like the antipathy towards Martin Amis, which is very strong and very kind of if you're around people who think of themselves as serious writers now, and you mention Martin Amis, they fucking hate him. In a way, it's a knee-jerk response, which doesn't. They know him to be a misogynist and a racist, I guess. I did an exhibition. There is a bit of a crossover between the right. I did this exhibition in the Baltic Museum, and I called it Lucky Jim because it's a title that everyone recognises. And it's a great title, but to which there is no current knee-jerk response. If I called it the Rachel Papers, everyone would have.
The other thing, I thought we had a great discussion about art and science, and I guess if C.P. Stone was writing today, he'd talk about paradigm shifts, wouldn't he, and Thomas Kuhn, and
yes,
I mean there is that parallel, but in a comic way as well. Scientists also are grant monkeys, filling in lots of grant applications.
Well, one of the sort of differences and parallel things, this is one of the other running things in the book, is that the way artists and scientists the slightly demeaning ways they have to sing for their supper are something very much in common.
Yeah, it's a very clever intertwining through the book.
And the other thing is madness. You know, there's lots of cliches about mad scientists.
Yes.
And perhaps it's because artists and scientists are both trying to smash the paradigm and build the new.
Well, they're both fields in which the term genius are used without it feeling as if it's a slightly misapplied use of it. Oh, wow, yes.
I just sort of following on from that, really. I'm interested to sort of observe that neuroscience and physics have a very privileged position as kind of explainers of things now. There's a lot of popular science books where a neuroscientist will tell you something about the personality.
Yes, and you read through these. There's loads on the internet. Neuroscience says this, that, and the other, and it turns out to be it doesn't. Whatever this journalist has got hold of as an idea from neuroscience turns out not to be very much. Yeah.
Was that something you wanted to address?
Well, no, not really, because when I was well, no, because when I started writing the book, it hadn't quite reached that level of there wasn't the media attention about neuroscience. It was becoming more accessible, but it wasn't becoming the kind of science that people think they know in the way that physics is the kind of science that people think they know.
And does it relate to, arts, sort of marginality in that sense?
I'm sorry?
Well, if science has a kind of, premier position as an explainer in our culture, whereas arts become increasingly marginal or sort of kooky, or whether that's the kind of contrast you were interested in.
That's how both neuroscience and art have been perceived. During the 12 years it's taken from me actually writing the book, the way those two things have been perceived, the media profile, or whatever you want to call it, of those two things has actually shifted quite a lot, and is still shifting. When I started writing the book, the winners of the Turner Prize were people that everyone could name. Art was having a kind of a day in the sun in terms of its relationship to public consciousness, public awareness, and neuroscience was carrying towards that. And it's hard to the situation now, because we're in the middle of it, is less readable. Certainly, it's less easy to name recent winners of the Turner Prize. Artists are not becoming public figures in the way they were in the late 90s, early noughties. My theory about that is that the art world has become, in that time, in quite a short time, so huge. The art world is much bigger than it was 25 years ago. And if you were very ambitious and you wanted to be famous 25 years ago, then you had to become famous sort of in the normal way. You had to become famous so that you were in the newspapers and people had heard of you. Whereas the art world has now got so big, you can be famous in terms of the number of people who have heard of you, and still nobody have heard of you outside of the art world.
Do you think there's a sense in which, again, the contrast that you have in the book, but the neuroscience kind of, it sort of undermines the art in a way, because you've got a neuroscientist who's pointing out to the artist that there's no such thing as objective colour, for example.
Yes.
And in a way, it kind of pulls the whole right out of art, doesn't it? The neuroscientist, who's very much a scientist who has no real knowledge of the art world itself.
And isn't he likes the nameless narrator, an artist, is sort of guided through neuroscience by a young young neuroscientist who's one of the most sympathetic characters in the book, and it rubs off the way it rubs off. It's all one way. So the artist, well, it's a bit like a Bildun's romance. He improves as a person, he's learning stuff. His guide, the neuroscientist, never gets interested in contemporary art, and he thinks it's a bit of a sort of silly thing to do all the way through. He tolerates it, as he tolerates the character, the narrator.
In the curve, the emotional maturity curve of the nameless hero, is there a feeling at the end that he's more or less interested in art?
It ends sort of, he's improved in some ways. His behaviour is improved because he's realised and his insight into the morality of what he's doing is clearer, and so he becomes a better behaved but a morally more ambiguous figure.
Right.
Because he's party he's party to something in which some patients are given an exhibition,
Yeah.
as if you're being generous to the patients, but the credit for that goes to the organisers of the exhibition. The patients get their credit.
Yeah. It's a very recognisable scenario.
Yes.
Anybody else want to know what's going on
Should we
in
make
this
that
book?
the last question? One more?
I wanted to ask, do you think it could ever reverse? Could we go back to the mad artist and bad behaviour? Would that be acceptable in society ever again? Do you think there'll be a backlash against
there are funny little sort
computer
of
using?
There is a it's replayed in a sort of comic form every now and then in the art world. So there's a little scene in New York where there's some artists who also made a big deal out of themselves being drug abusers on a huge scale, and then one of them died. This guy called Dash Snow died of a heroin overdose, and all the people in that scene thought he was taken before his time. I'd say it's a sort of almost parodic replaying of those ideas, but as it being, in the sense of it being genuinely towering figures, like Pollock and de Kooning, who also behave like that, no, it's not happening. The culture is hugely in flux. We're right in the middle of it, and all I know is that it's in flux. What things are going to look like 20 years from now, I think it's really hard to tell. Really, really, really hard to tell.
But meanwhile, everybody should buy your book.
Yes.
Yes. That's one thing we can agree on.
I shouldn't have been so sort of like, I shouldn't have had to think about that, should I?
Well, good luck with your book.
Yes.
Good luck
Thank you all
with
for
those
coming.
other two.